I would like to make three separate points. I'd first of all like to talk about the specific consequences of this conflict for Ukraine, talk a little bit about the prospects for escalation, and talk a little bit about the prospects for ending the war in the foreseeable future. Starting with Ukraine, this war is an unmitigated disaster for Ukraine. As I noted earlier, Putin made it clear in 2008 that Russia would wreck Ukraine to prevent it from joining NATO. He is delivering on that promise. Russian forces have conquered at least 20% of Ukrainian territory and destroyed or badly damaged many Ukrainian cities and towns. More than 6.5 million Ukrainians have fled the country, while more than 8 million have been internally displaced. Many thousands of Ukrainians, including innocent civilians, are dead or badly wounded, and the Ukrainian economy is in shambles. The World Bank estimates that Ukraine's economy will shrink by almost 50% over the course of 2022. Estimates are that approximately $100 billion worth of damage has been inflicted on Ukraine already, and it will take close to $1 trillion to rebuild the country. In the meantime, Kyiv requires about $5 billion of aid every month just to keep the government running. Furthermore, there appears to be little hope that Ukraine will be able to regain use of the Azov and Black Seas, the ports on the Azov and Black Seas anytime soon. Before the war, roughly 70% of all Ukrainian exports and imports and 98% of its grain exports move through these ports. This is the basic situation after less than 4 months of fighting. It is downright scary to contemplate what Ukraine is going to look like if this war drags on for a few more years. So, this brings me to the second topic I want to talk about. What are the prospects for negotiating a peace agreement and ending this war in the next few months? I am sorry to say that I see no way this war ends anytime soon. And this is a view shared by prominent policymakers on both the Western side and the Russian side. The main reason for my pessimism is that both Russia and the United States are deeply committed to winning the war, and it is impossible to reach an agreement where both sides win. To be more specific, the key to a settlement from Russia's perspective is making Ukraine a neutral state, which means that Ukraine must divorce itself from the West, especially the United States. But that outcome is unacceptable to the Biden administration and a large portion of the American foreign policy establishment, because it would represent a victory for Russia. Ukrainian leaders have agency, of course, and thus one might hope that given all the horror being inflicted on their country, they will push for neutralization. Indeed, Zelensky briefly mentioned that possibility in the first month of the war, but he never seriously pursued it. There's little chance, however, that Kyiv will push for neutralization, because the ultra-nationalists in Ukraine, who wield significant political power, have zero interest in yielding to any of Russia's demands, especially one that dictates Ukraine's political alignment with the outside world. The Biden administration and the countries on NATO's eastern flank, and here we're talking about Poland and the Baltic states, they're likely to support Ukraine's ultranationalists, along with the Americans, on this whole issue of creating a neutral Ukraine. To complicate matters further, how does one deal with the large swaths of Ukrainian territory that Russia has conquered since the war started, as well as Crimea's fate. It's hard to fathom Moscow giving up any of the Ukrainian territory it now occupies, much less all of it, at least in the foreseeable future. Russia's territorial goals today are probably not the ones they started the war with. At the same time, it's difficult to imagine any Ukrainian leader accepting a deal that allows Russia to keep any Ukrainian territory, except possibly Crimea. I certainly hope I'm wrong, but I see no end in sight to this ruinous war. Let me turn to the final matter, which is the matter of escalation. It's widely accepted among international relations scholars that there is a powerful tendency for protracted wars to escalate. Other countries get dragged into the fight, and the level of violence is likely to escalate. The potential for this happening in Ukraine is real. There is a danger that the United States and its NATO allies will get dragged into the fighting, which they have been able to avoid up to this point, even though we are now effectively at war with Russia. There's also the possibility that nuclear weapons might be used in Ukraine, and that might even lead to a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States. The underlying reason that these outcomes might be realized is that the stakes are so high for both sides, and thus neither can afford to lose. As I have emphasized, Putin and his lieutenants believe that Ukraine joining the West is an existential threat to Russia that must be eliminated. In practical terms, that means Russia must win its war in Ukraine. Defeat is unacceptable. The Biden administration, on the other hand, has stressed that its goal is not only to defeat the Russians in Ukraine, but also to use massive sanctions to do egregious damage to the Russian economy. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has emphasized that the West's goal is to weaken Russia to the point where it could not invade Ukraine again. In effect, the Biden administration is committed to knocking Russia out of the ranks of the great powers. At the same time, President Biden himself has called Russia's war in Ukraine a genocide and charged Putin with being a war criminal who should face, quote, a war crimes trial after the war. Such rhetoric hardly lends itself to negotiating an end to the war. After all, how do you negotiate with a genocidal state? American policy has two significant consequences. For starters, it greatly amplifies the existential threat Moscow faces in this war, and it makes it more important than ever that Moscow prevail in Ukraine. At the same time, it means that the United States is deeply committed to making sure that Russia loses. The Biden administration has now invested so much in the war, both materially and rhetorically, that a Russian victory would represent a devastating defeat for Washington. Obviously, both sides can't win. Moreover, there's a serious possibility that one side will begin to lose badly. There is a serious possibility of that. If American policy succeeds and the Russians are losing to the Ukrainians on the battlefield, Putin might turn to nuclear weapons to rescue the situation. The U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, told the Senate this past May that this was one of the two situations that might lead Putin to use nuclear weapons if he is losing in Ukraine. For those of you who think it's unlikely that he would turn to use nuclear weapons to rescue the situation if he's losing in Ukraine, I would remind you that NATO planned to use nuclear weapons in similar circumstances during the Cold War. We were planning to use nuclear weapons in West Germany if the Warsaw Pact overran West Germany. If we were losing against the Warsaw Pact in West Germany, we were going to turn to nuclear weapons to rescue the situation. That's what we're talking about Putin doing. You don't think he'll do it? I wouldn't bet a lot of money on that. If Russia were to employ nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it's difficult to say how the Biden administration would react, but it would surely be under great pressure to retaliate, thus raising the possibility of a great power nuclear war. There is a perverse paradox at play here. You really want to think about this. The more successful we are, the United States and its allies, at achieving our war aims, the more likely it is that the war will turn nuclear.